So I had the pleasure to hear Dr. Lembke's lecture when we invited her to do a training for clinical interns. And I'm sure all of you have gone through this feeling or thought where you reach a certain age and you think, well, I've heard it all, or I know enough about it. And when I sat through her lecture, within 5 minutes, I went through, oh my God, this is really cool. I didn't look at it this way. I didn't understand it that way. So I was really amazed by Dr. Lembke's ability to reframe the addiction cycle, the understanding of substance abuse and so forth in terms that I, as a therapist, again, with the thought of I know it all, which I don't, but sometimes, as Stephanie Brown was saying, the entitlement, was able to put in perspective. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Lembke. And Dr. Lembke received her undergrad degrees in humanities from Yale University and her medical degree from Stanford University. She is on the faculty of the Stanford University School of Medicine, a diplomat in both the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and the American Board of Addiction Medicine. She is the program director for the Stanford Addiction Medicine Program and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and commentaries, including in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Journal of General Internal Medicine, and Addiction. Dr. Lembke sees patients, teaches, and does research. She is releasing a new book on the prescription epidemic entitled Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Got Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. So it's my privilege to welcome Dr. Lembke to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful compliment. And thank you to Adolescent Counseling Services for inviting me to speak today. So today, broadly, what I'd like to speak about first is the risk factors for addiction. I'm going to kind of summarize the scientific literature to date, including the social science literature and the neuroscience literature, on what we know about what makes kids vulnerable to developing an addictive disorder later in life. Then I'm going to use the case of a patient of mine who's given me permission to tell his story to you today, in order to describe the progression from recreational use to addictive use, and as well to highlight one of the risk factors that I think is of particular relevance for young people today, and that Stephanie Brown in her wonderful talk also touched upon. And then finally, I'm going to briefly address some of the elements of recovery. And I have a question mark here after that, because we really are living in a new age in terms of how we define recovery and how we achieve recovery. And my underlying message for today is I think it's going to take our collective will and all of our creativity to figure out how to do recovery in today's world. So very broadly speaking, the risk factors for addiction can be categorized into one of three groups: nature, nurture, and neighborhood. When I talk about nature, what I'm talking about is the risks that an individual is born with, embedded in the DNA. 50 to 75% of the risk of becoming addicted later in life is genetic. This is really powerful. This is based on studies by work of Mark Schuckett, for example, who prospectively followed sons of alcoholics and showed that 50% of them went on to develop an alcohol use disorder. It's also based on family and twin studies showing that those with specifically a parent or a grandparent with an addictive disorder was at 2 to 4 times the increased risk of developing an addictive disorder later in life compared to the general population. And this is really important. Even if that child was not raised in the alcoholic home, that risk held true. So obviously, for a complex behavior like addiction, we're not going to find a single gene to figure out what's transmitting it from one generation to the next. This is going to be a complex heredity, like most behavioral and mental health disorders. But scientists are beginning to explore what are some of the factors that we can pin down that might be more targetable in terms of finding a specific gene, and that also might explain this progression or this vulnerability in the DNA to developing addiction. And very broadly speaking, what scientists are doing with this is kind of looking at top-down versus bottom-up processing when they're thinking about innate vulnerability to addiction. So if you imagine that the brain is an automobile and that the frontal lobe is the brakes, the limbic system, which is the emotional processing system, is the engine, then people are beginning to speculate that addiction vulnerability may arise by some sort of abnormal dysfunction in either the brakes or the engine. Just to give you a couple examples, we know that attention deficit disorder is correlated with an increased risk for the development of an addictive disorder later in life. And in many ways, attention deficit disorder can be conceptualized as a problem with the frontal lobe or in the brakes of the car. We also know that emotion dysregulation early in life, and we see that in some kids, they get themselves into an emotional state. It's a very intensely experienced emotion for them. They have a really hard time coming down from that emotional state. This is what we call a propensity for emotion dysregulation. This is also correlated with later developing an addictive disorder and can be conceptualized as a possible problem with the engine driving addictive behaviors later in life. The genetic data that we have on impulsivity is really powerful. So impulsivity is a trait that's fairly well defined and that we know is highly heritable from one generation to the other. And we also know is highly correlated with the development of addiction. And impulsivity is usually described negatively in that we think of impulsive people as people who are not good at restraining their emotions, who act before they think. But I would just suggest to you that in certain contexts, impulsivity could be a very good thing. If you were on a plane and you saw somebody and you thought to yourself, that person has a gun, maybe they're a terrorist, and maybe you acted on that immediately and jumped them, and maybe saved the whole plane from going down. If you were right, then that would be a good thing. If you were wrong, that would be a very bad thing. So let's talk a little bit more about impulsivity, because this is the area that not just neuroscientists and psychologists are looking at, but even behavioral economists are very interested in this idea of impulsivity and temporal discounting. So what you see here, this little boy, some of you might recognize from a very famous Stanford experiment called the marshmallow experiment. Basically, they put little kids in a room with a couple of marshmallows, and they said to them, now you sit here, we'll be back in a bit, do not eat these marshmallows. And then they walked out, and they measured how much time it took for the kid to eat the marshmallows, or not in some cases. Then they followed these kids prospectively for many years afterwards and looked at delayed gratification and later success in life. And it will probably not surprise you to hear that those who were better at delaying gratification and not eating those marshmallows ended up doing in general better later on. Those kids who were more impulsive and who had to gratify their urge to have the marshmallow, even though they were told not to eat it, tended to have, in general, more problems. And the expression on this little boy's face is willpower in action. So the way that behavioral economists conceptualize impulsivity is by making what's called indifference curves. And I don't know how well you can see this, but here you have three different curves. The red curve here is the high impulsivity individual, and the green curve is the low impulsivity individual. And here you have the value of whatever it is. And the main point of this curve, which economists have studied this in great depth, is that, as you can see, if you delay by 5 minutes for the impulsive individual, the value of that object is much lower than for the non-impulsive individual. In other words, the delay discounts the value greatly for an impulsive individual, more greatly than it would for a non-impulsive individual. So this should sort of be percolating in your brain as you think about addiction. Just to throw out a question for all of you to kind of bring it home, imagine that you were really, really hungry, that you hadn't had anything to eat in about 24 hours for whatever reason, and that you really, really liked candy bars. Now I'm going to offer you one candy bar right now that you can eat, or 2 candy bars tomorrow. How many of you would take the 1 candy bar right now? Right, yeah, because your appetite is driving that. right? That makes a lot more. I would take that one candy bar right now too. But now, what if I told you, I'm going to give you one candy bar in 100 days, or I'm going to give you 2 candy bars in 101 days? How many of you would take the one candy bar in 100 days? You still would. Okay, good for you. Why not? But in general, with that kind of delay, most people would wait the 101 days and take the candy bar. So the impulsive individual is just the individual who innately, the child who innately discounts the value of something if they have to wait for it, whereas if they get it right now, it has tremendous value for them. The other thing that is innate and is a stepping stone to vulnerability to develop an addictive disorder is co-occurring mental illness. We know the rates of co-occurring mental illness in individuals who have psychiatric disorders is much higher than in the general population. And this always comes up in my clinical work. Parents or patients say to me, I don't really have addiction. What it is, I'm self-medicating my depression, my anxiety, my attention deficit disorder. So I don't have too much time to go into this in as much depth as I'd like, but let me just say that I'm not a fan of the self-medication language for a number of reasons. First of all, we know that it is true, let me first validate, it is true that if you have a mental illness and you experience psychiatric symptoms, it makes sense that you're more vulnerable to try substances in order to take away those feelings. But if you then progress from there to addiction, you have 2 disorders, and it is not true that treating the underlying ADHD, depression, anxiety, is then going to resolve the addictive disorder. And that's really the take-home message. Even if your psychiatric illness was your doorway into addiction, once you have a full-blown addictive disorder, we certainly want to address the underlying psychiatric illness, but we also need to treat the addiction concurrently. Okay, moving on to nurture. Nurture addresses the kind of upbringing that you have, the values in your home, the attachments with major caregivers. And what the literature shows in terms of risk for the later development of addiction is that increased risk is associated with parents who model substance use as a form of coping in the home. It's associated with early childhood trauma. And it is associated with parents who have a limited attachment with their children or a conflicted attachment with their children. All of that sort of makes common sense, but it's been borne out by voluminous, well-done studies. So I would say to you that in terms of protective factors, this is one of the rare situations in which helicopter parents might actually get good billing. It turns out that if you are closely monitoring your children, if you know where they are and what they're doing and what they have in their backpack and under their pillow and between the mattress, then you are potentially mitigating the risk. But as always, there are no guarantees. And in my work, I have seen so many wonderful, loving, giving, mindful, structured, conscientious parents who nonetheless have a child who develops a very serious substance or other addictive disorder. And so I think that's an important message that I want to convey, that these are all risk factors, but even when none of those risk factors are there, addiction can happen. The final major category is neighborhood. I'm talking here in terms of the strict geographic sense of neighborhood, but also the more abstract sense of neighborhood. So we know that if you live in a neighborhood where drugs are sold on the street corner, you're at increased risk to try drugs and become addicted to them because of sheer access. We also know that things like poverty and unemployment contribute to the risk of developing addiction, the lack of alternative rewards in that context. Let me stop for a moment about access, because I think this is one of the major points I want to make today about the larger neighborhood in which children are being raised and the greatly increased access they have to, in particular, drugs that were much harder to get for prior generations. This is a rat study, and I want you to focus here on, not on these 2 graphs, you can ignore those are showing something different, but these 3 graphs, these were rats who were put in a confined environment and offered methamphetamine for 1 hour a day over the course of these sessions. And what you can see is that 1 hour a day, whether it was methamphetamine, heroin, or cocaine, their use rates remained pretty much stable. Even within that hour over time, they didn't escalate. But when they were exposed to methamphetamine, heroin, or cocaine for 6 hours a day, what you saw was this greatly increased use over time. So the point I'm trying to make here is that access really does matter. There are issues with the timing of this too, but if rats and humans have more access to drugs, they are more likely to become addicted to those drugs. It increases their risk. And I'll talk later a little bit about what's going on with this progression and this increased use. So now I'd like to introduce my patient, Justin. This is not his real name, and again, he's given me permission to share his story with you. And I'm going to use his story as a way to illustrate the progression from recreational to addictive use. I'm going to talk about the neuroscience to date on what addiction is, what's happening in the brain, and then I'm going to talk about his recovery. But I really want to, the reason I chose Justin's story is because I really think it illustrates one of the larger points that I want to make is that one of the big risks is this metaphorical neighborhood that kids are now having to live in, where even if other risks are absent, they have this incredible access to drugs that they didn't have previously, which even the most conscientious helicopter parents are going to have difficulty overcoming. So Justin was born and raised right here in the Bay Area in Concord. He is the only child of middle-class Jewish parents, hardworking, loving, devoted to their only child, no family history of addiction, and really no childhood trauma whatsoever. He was a kind of a nerdy kid, a little bit pudgy. He got teased for his weight, but he remembers that school was fun, and he especially liked science, anything to do with computers, really nothing early on, and not an impulsive child, and not an emotionally dysregulated child. If anything, enormous kind of emotional restraint and some affective flatness. Let me just digress for a moment and talk a little bit about the gateway hypothesis of addiction. So this is kind of a controversial hypothesis. It's debated. But the basic definition of this gateway hypothesis is that there are certain drugs, whether by nature of their effects on the brain, their unique properties, or by simple opportunity access reasons, that adolescents will try and then will lead them to try harder drugs later on. And the classic gateway drugs are cigarettes and alcohol, right here, that eventually lead maybe to marijuana, which is still sort of illegal, that eventually lead to harder drugs like cocaine, and finally heroin being seen as sort of the end of the line of this progression. But what I would pose to you today is that in the modern world, this gateway hypothesis has really been turned on its head, and that cigarettes and alcohol are no longer a gateway because kids today have this incredible access either through a doctor's prescription or their friends at school or online pharmacies or whatever it is to very hard drugs that previously would have come much later in a drug-seeking career. So what happened to Justin is when he was in his mid-teens, he needed his wisdom teeth removed. He went to the dentist and had that done. And he remembers waking up in the middle of the procedure, and he heard the drill going, and he thought to himself, where am I? What's going on? He was partially anesthetized, and he was given analgesics in the form of opioids. And he remembers an incredible sense of well-being, even though the drill was going, the lights were bright, he was getting his tooth pulled out. He sort of felt different than he ever had before. When the wisdom teeth procedure removal was done, he received a 30-day prescription of Vicodin, and he took that home, and he took the Vicodin initially as prescribed, And again, went to school and sort of looked around him and thought to himself, wow, is this how everybody else feels? It was really kind of an unprecedented sense of being comfortable with himself. So he proceeded to take a more than prescribed until the prescription ran out. And then when it did, although he had no longer had any more pain, he asked his mother to take him back to the dentist to get more pain pills, saying that he did have more pain. They went back to the dentist together. He explained what his situation was, and he received another 30-day supply. When that ran out too, Justin, being generally a risk-averse kid, did not want to go back to the doctor and lie again. He felt uncomfortable about lying in the first place. But what he did do is he discovered a whole new group of friends at his high school. And he began to experiment with a very wide range of substances, something he had never previously considered, really. These were not the people that he normally hung out with. His parents didn't model drug or alcohol use. And he tried tobacco, didn't like the way it made him feel. He tried pot, didn't like the way it made him feel. Tried alcohol, didn't like it, but he loved opioids. And through bartering with peers at school, paying for pills, he began to almost exclusively consume opioids obtained during school, as well as other kinds of prescription pills that had similar effects, things like soma, sedating agents. He describes being high almost all of his high school day, but kind of making sure that he could pull it together in time to kind of present himself to his parents, who never suspected what was going on because he got really pretty good at hiding it and lying about it. And this went on for his entire high school career. This is just to illustrate that at one point he remembers he took some soma, which caused him to gyrate in his chair at the back of the room. He remembers falling off his chair and the kids laughing at him, and doesn't remember, and maybe his memory is faulty, I have no corroborating evidence, but doesn't remember any kind of reaction to that from the teachers or any other school resources. So an experience of being intoxicated through most of his high school career with no one stepping in and saying, is there something going on here? Just again to point out that his preference was the pills, and that he's certainly not alone. Kids today represent a new pill generation. Surveys have showed that kids today see getting high from pills as a safer high than using other substances. They believe that pills in any form from any source represent something safer than something that they might buy on the street, not in pill form. And just so you can see kind of the favorites among, this is from Monitoring the Future study. The favorite is still pot, and we also know today in surveys of adolescents that as pot use has gone up among teens, their perception of the risks associated with pot use have gone down. So as we have medicalized marijuana in our society, kids are more likely to use marijuana, and those things may well be linked. But you see this, the most common besides cannabis is Vicodin, which is an opioid painkiller, followed by amphetamines, which is similar to Adderall and other stimulants they might get prescribed, trading around at the school, tranquilizers, things like Xanax, benzodiazepine, cough medicines, and on from there. This is a TEDS report, which shows the most common reason that people get admitted to treatment centers. And you can see here in this progression from 1992 to 2011 that cocaine was the most common, followed by, I'm trying to trace this one out, heroin. But the big story really here is that other opioids, mainly prescription opioids, have had a huge rise in the last decade and a half, and likewise marijuana. And this was an image that was in the New York Times recently. I'm sure many of you saw it. It was an article discussing opioid overdose deaths in this country. And just to sort of make it easy for you, the more orange there is, the more overdose deaths there have been. And in 2003, there certainly is some orange there, but look at 2014, a huge, huge increase in overdose deaths in this country. And this is data that just came out from the CDC, further documenting this rise in the nation in prescription opioid pain reliever related deaths. The really sad story here is that the latest data from 2014 came out just this past year, and we had all been hoping that because of interventions in this time period, for example, naloxone to reverse opioid overdose deaths, more prescriber education, rescheduling things like Vicodin from a Schedule 3 to a Schedule 2 drug would make a dent in the rate of opioid overdose deaths, but what we're finding is that the numbers are just going up. Likewise, national overdose deaths from heroin have increased. The reasons for the increase in the number of heroin deaths in this country is debated and controversial. Some people postulate that now that doctors are cracking down and not prescribing as readily, young people are turning to heroin because it's cheaper and easier to get. But I think that, and others have written and commented that what has really happened, as in Justin's case, is that young people have gotten a taste for it, and having gotten a taste for it, then have less qualms about trying heroin to continue that habit. And the point really here is that these increase in heroin deaths are fueled primarily by 18 to 25-year-olds. So it's really the young people. And that's been true in my clinical experience when I see an older individual, middle-aged, older in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who have become addicted to prescription drugs. They almost universally tell me they would never use heroin, that it crosses a kind of line that they would never cross. And that's not true for young people. They will try just about anything. Okay, so I think that it would be fair to say that by the time Justin graduated from high school, he was not addicted to drugs. He was using frequently, but he could stop for periods at a time if it was not available to him. Certainly, or maybe you would categorize it as mild addiction. We know that this is a spectrum disorder, but he could still intermittently, stop using. But the big problem for him was that his primary source was his peers at school. He had never really gone to a drug dealer or any other source for drugs. And when high school was over and he lost that access, he was in a bit of a bind because he didn't want to stop using. So that's when he turned to the internet. And right now what I'm going to do is just talk briefly about the role of the internet in increasing access for all people, but I think in particular for our very internet-savvy young people today. So young people go on the internet to find out about new highs. Here are examples of using ketamine. You can buy ketamine in a head shop where it's sold specifically with a labeling that says not for human consumption. This is a typical way that head shops get around the laws that forbid ketamine use. They say they're using it as a bath salt or as an herb of some sort. So as long as they say it's not for human consumption on the label, then they can skirt the laws. But of course, everybody going into that shop buying ketamine is there to use it for their consumption to get high. There's a new trend among teens called drank or lean, and it's a combination of codeine, which can be found in cough syrup, and dextromethorphan, which can be found in cough syrup. So kids, they get these ideas from each other, they try it out, then they write about their experiences. The other thing there are is illegal cyber pharmacies, which are very popular. Kids going online and basically ordering primarily benzodiazepines, opioid painkillers, and stimulants from illegal pharmacies, many of which are located overseas, and they order them with FedEx delivered to the house. They also go online and order what are called research chemicals. So research chemicals is a very interesting nebulous category. Again, you probably can't see this, but it says here at the bottom, all research chemical products sold are strictly not for human consumption. But everybody who goes onto these sites is there to get these chemicals for a high. This is for clonazepam. Clonazepam is kind of a combination of Klonopin and Xanax, if any of you are familiar with those drugs. It's incredibly potent, very powerful, very dangerous benzodiazepine, which people can now get online as a research chemical. I think the language around this is fascinating and also very disturbing. The kids then go back online on various sites and talk about their quote-unquote research. So this young person says, I've researched atazolam, it's a benzodiazepine, quite a bit over the past year. I enjoyed the research, but have somewhat hit a wall in my findings. So these kids are gathering data. These are their findings. I believe it's time to move on. I would like to do more research in a similar class of drugs. And then they ask each other, what are you using? You know, how did it work for you? And they build community this way. And I think that's the most disturbing part. Not only are they obtaining information on these sites, but they're actually building community. So an obvious question is, why not shut down these illegal sites that are operating in direct opposition to the Controlled Substances Act? Very, very hard to do. Often the website itself is located in Uzbekistan. You've got the funding coming from somewhere in Mexico City, the profits held somewhere in the Cayman Islands, the actual owner living in Florida. So it would require different countries to coordinate and cooperate to shut these sites down. And no sooner are they shut down than they're reestablished again a day later in a different place. So very, very tough. Also, many of these sites operate using the deep web. The deep web is not something I'm very knowledgeable about, but basically it's an operating system that doesn't allow transactions to be traced. People often use Bitcoin, which likewise can't be traced. And so there's this whole kind of universe that is very scary, that is very hard to track. So Justin was living at home with his parents. His parents were working, and he was supposed to be going to community college or looking to get a job. He was doing spending some of his time doing those things, but also spending quite a bit of time online at these various sites. He would order the research chemicals or the cyber pharmacy drugs. They would be delivered to his house. He would make sure to get the packages before his parents found them, and he was doing his own research. Much of his use at this time was solitary and in his room. Then he was invited to a party. He's not a very social, gregarious type of person, but he decided to go to this party. This is just sort of meant to be a bit of irony here, a party in the 1950s and parties now. But Justin went to this party, and he met up with some old friends that he had used with in high school, and they introduced him to heroin. And he tried snorting a little heroin and really liked the way it made him feel, and really thought of himself at this point as still a researcher. So decided to get a month's worth of heroin and give it a try. So heroin is a really interesting drug for a couple of reasons. Culturally, we think of heroin as this awful, terrible thing that's so different from the prescription painkillers that doctors are giving their patients. But in many ways, heroin is molecularly almost identical to morphine, which is often used as a painkiller. Just has two added acetyl groups. Heroin was actually in the early 1900s was sold on over the counter alongside Bayer aspirin as a safe, non-addictive painkiller. The truthfully really scary thing about heroin is that because many people shoot it up, you have dirty needles and you have an increased risk of transmission of diseases like HIV, hepatitis C. But the molecule itself is actually no more dangerous than other prescription opioids that are readily available. So Justin used heroin for a month, and when he ran out, he experienced something he had never experienced before, and that was incredible withdrawal. And it was very, very scary for him. He had all the physiologic symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sweats, chills, but he had an incredible psychological panic where he really felt like he was going to die. So he went back to the heroin dealer that he had met at the party. He got more heroin, and he kept on like that until essentially he had run out of all of his savings. This is just, again, to show you the different ways that heroin can be used. It can be injected. It can be snorted or smoked. The bottom picture is someone engaging in what's called chasing the dragon. This is the most common way that heroin is ingested in China, or one of the most common ways. And it's called chasing the dragon because you put the heroin on a bit of tinfoil, a heat source underneath, and then you insufflate this sort of plume of smoke. And this is meant to look a little bit or conjure up the image of a dragon's tail. But the other reason that using heroin this way is called chasing the dragon is because you're always chasing that high again, that of a mythical creature so hard to find. So the long and the short of it is that when Justin ran out of money, he essentially went to his drug dealer and he said, I'm run out of money, but I need more heroin. Can I work for you? And so his drug dealer put him to work in his lab where he was making heroin from morphine. So morphine was readily available from sources across the Mexican border. Heroin was hard to get. So he put Justin to work in a lab, and I just show this picture to sort of juxtapose the kind of lab that Justin was working in and the kind of lab that he potentially could have been working in, given his intelligence and the privilege that he was born into, and all of the things that were going for him before heroin got a hold of him. Very sad. So what Justin did was, again, he went online and he researched various recipes for how to make heroin from morphine. He ordered acetic anhydride, and he had it shipped to his parents' house, and he would make sure he intercepted the packages, and he would bring them back to his employer's house, his drug dealer, and then he would basically make heroin, and it really wasn't very hard. You put a little bit of morphine, acetic anhydride, you mix it up like brownies, you put it in the oven, you wait a couple hours, low temperature, it bakes, you take it out, you have heroin. He then cut it with lactose to try to increase their profits, put it in these little bags and sold them on the street for about $10. It's about a dollar per milligram of heroin. And the point that I want to make here is just, again, how the internet is this incredible portal to information that, if used by vulnerable individuals, can really lead them down a very scary path. So I asked Justin, well, what was a typical day like for you when you were living with your drug dealer and using heroin? What did you tell your parents about what you were doing? He said he told his parents he was living and working with a friend. He had plenty of money, so that kind of corroborated that story. But basically, he said we would wake up around 1 o'clock every day and we would have breakfast and then we would start working. And I said, well, what did you have for breakfast? He said, well, we had heroin for breakfast. And he and his drug dealer would sit across the table, and they both preferred snorting, so they would set up a couple lines, and he would snort, and then his dealer would snort, and they did that till they were sort of both satisfied. And then they would go on. Justin never went out and sold. That made him very nervous. He just stayed in the lab and worked. His dealer went out and sold. But, I said to Justin, I said, wow, did you ever sort of stop and think about, like, what you were doing there and what it all meant? And he said, when I was using heroin at that rate, my life was complete. And I thought that was really profound, that in that state, when he could have been living in a house like this, but was living in a house like that, and using heroin every day, he felt complete. That's really important for us to understand that in order to understand addiction. Addiction is essentially a phenomenon of the hijacked brain. And what that means is, we talked before about the engine and the brakes and the frontal lobe. What happens in real addiction, when you get severe addiction, is the capacity to use the frontal lobe for future planning, for insight, for judgment, to make decisions, is completely co-opted by the need to obtain and use the drug. Okay? And there's amazing neuroscience work that people are doing to support this, but the way that I like to explain, sort of and summarize the neuroscience to date is in the following way. Imagine that in your brain there's a balance like this one, okay? And it's in your brain in order to help you determine what is pleasurable and what is painful. And you need that to live, right? Because you need to approach things that are pleasurable and you need to avoid things that are painful. That's evolutionarily adaptive, okay? So what happens, though, in the brain? And the balance, importantly, starts out level. Neither one side or another is tipped down, okay? But now you do something that's pleasurable. And in my case, that would be eating a piece of chocolate. And when I eat that piece of chocolate, what happens? When I tip this way, I experience pleasure, okay? So it tips this way. What's happening in the brain is there's dopamine, which is a very important neurotransmitter, intimately connected with the reward system in the brain, and that's released, and that tells my brain good things are happening. But at the same time, my brain balance wants to be level. That is its baseline state. So changes occur in the brain by down-regulating or producing less of my own dopamine, down-regulating dopamine receptors. I kind of think of it as these little gremlins hopping on the other side of the balance, the neuroadaptation gremlins, because they've got to get the balance level again. So they do that. So now I'm level again, the chocolate is eaten, and I've got gremlins on the right side. So I think to myself, you know what, that was delicious. I'm going to have a second piece. I have a second piece of chocolate, and what happens? Boop. Hey, what's going on? The first time I got this, right? The second time I got this. That's because the gremlins are over there weighing down the other side of the balance. My brain was changed by that experience of pleasure because my brain wants to be in homeostasis. Okay, so that's a very everyday example. Now let's take the example of addictive drugs, heroin, cannabis, alcohol, you name it. I ingest alcohol, and unless I have some kind of allergy or some kind of unusual reaction, I don't just get a little bump, right? I get a great big bump. And that's the thing about addictive drugs or addictive behaviors in a given individual for whom they're rewarding. There's an enormous dopamine release. It tips the scale way, way down, okay? And then I have a whole lot of neuroadaptation that has to happen, little gremlins hopping on the right side, in order to right my balance again. They do it, it comes back up, I get righted, and then I have more alcohol and I don't get the same effect. The gremlins are over there, okay? Now imagine that you are using that addictive drug not just once or not just once a week or not just on a recreational occasional basis, but you're using heavy drugs every single day. And you're doing this more and more and more because you have to overcome the gremlins on the right side, right? That's what tolerance is. My brain has changed in response to the drugs. I need to use more of the drugs in order to get that same rewarding feeling I got the first time. And that can go on for weeks, months, and years. I'm using more and more and more and more. Then something happens and I decide, or maybe I can't get access anymore, but for whatever reason, I don't use the drugs anymore. So now imagine this, I've got all these gremlins on this side, I'm tipped over here, no more drug, what happens? Tick, 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 I come up like this. And by the way, when I'm moving in this direction, I'm experiencing pain. So this is the come down and it's painful. But do I stop here? I do not. Remember, the brain has changed. So I'm gonna keep tipping down all the way over there, and then I'm really in excruciating pain. And by the way, the gremlins are slow. They're really slow to figure out it's time for them to jump off so that my brain, my pleasure, pain, balance can be level again. They eventually figure it out, but in the meantime, what am I experiencing? A whole lot of psychological distress. And this can go on for weeks, months, even years. It's what George Koob calls dysphoria-driven relapse, okay? So I use again, and I'm using now, I'm not using to get high, I'm using just to level my balance again, just to feel normal, just to be able to function in the world. Do people know I'm using? Of course not, because I'm doing much better when I'm using, right, than I was when I wasn't using, okay? So this is what you need to understand about how the brain works when you think about addictive behavior. It's this hijacked phenomenon. This is especially dangerous in the developing brain. What we know about adolescence, so when you're a young child, you have an enormous number of neurons, okay, gray matter. It's the powerful stuff, right? And you have more than you'll ever have in your life when you're young. Now, when you get to adolescence, your brain begins to prune those neurons back because ultimately it wants to be an efficient brain. It doesn't want to have to make 6 decisions about which pathway to go on. It wants to know what the right pathway is. And so it begins to prune your neurons back until you're going to end up with your adult scaffolding of neurons, which is going to allow you to function best in the world. Okay, so that's the normal pathway. This picture shows that by showing that the gray matter volume, right here at 20 years old. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive, this image, but the gray matter volume, those neurons, that's the red. When you have a lot, you got red. 5 years, a lot. Now, you don't know how to use them. You're all over the place, right? But you got a lot of neurons. Then with maturation and age through adolescence, there's the pruning back. You actually have less gray matter once you're an adult than you did when you, but it's refined, it's organized, okay? Now you add to this process heavy substance use, and then you end up with a scaffolding that relies on that substance in order to function normally. If at this point you take away daily heavy cannabis use, you're kind of in trouble, okay? Because your scaffolding was built around that substance being there. It's not an insurmountable trouble, but this is why we are all so deeply concerned about young people engaging in heavy daily substance use. Okay, moving on. How do people recover from addiction? So Roy Wise, a neuroscientist who's done an enormous amount of work with animals, says that once you get an animal addicted to a substance, and by the way, one of the things I was shocked to learn is that it's pretty hard to get animals addicted. I thought you put any animal in a cage with any substance and they'll get addicted, they'll press the lever. Not true. Actually, it's a subset of animals that get addicted, and a subset that kind of won't. But if you take that subset of animals and you get them addicted, what makes them stop? Roy Wise says there are 3 things that make an addicted animal stop using substances. You take the substance away, okay? The animal becomes so exhausted that they cannot even locomote to obtain the substance or press the lever. The animal dies. Fortunately, that is not true with human beings, okay? Human beings are not rats, and human beings can, assuming that they still have frontal lobe capacity, have a moment of insight and reflect on what they're doing and decide to change their lives. And that is what happened to Justin after about a year of living with his drug dealer, using heavy amounts of heroin daily. Who knows why, sitting at his breakfast table, he suddenly had a flash and thought to himself, wow, I've been here for a year. If I keep doing this, it may be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I don't want to be here in 10 years. I need to get out. That to me is really, really interesting. That moment when somebody decides, I'm going to change this. But the other insight that Justin had was that he would not be able to do it without help. He recognized that he would experience such significant heroin withdrawal that he would have so much dysphoria-driven compulsion to use again that he would not be successful. So he reached out to the BART programs in Oakland. They provide methadone maintenance. He went there. They immediately took him and they put him on methadone, which is an opioid, and he had his first entry into recovery. Opioid replacement therapy for opioid addiction is highly stigmatized and has been stigmatized ever since its inception in the middle of the last century with methadone. More recently, we have as an alternative to methadone, Suboxone, which is also an opioid agonist, approved just in the last 15 years for the treatment of opioid use disorder. But there is still enormous resistance to using these methods to treat an opioid addiction. So what I want to do is basically tell you that in this wonderful article by my colleague Keith Humphreys, who's standing in the back on his phone, we're going to embarrass him for a second. Basically, this is a great review of sort of all of the treatments for addiction ever conceived of and what their effectiveness is. And what you will find in reading this article is that again and again, through multiple studies across many different countries and societies and cultures, opioid replacement therapy has been shown by the scientific data to be one of the most robust treatments for opioid use disorders. Not only does it decrease use of illicit drugs and decrease addictive patterns, but it also decreases homelessness, improves mood, decreases transmission of HIV, Hep C, and other infectious diseases. It's a very, very powerful and important tool. Yay for Suboxone. And I like that because I know a lot of people, and before I was in this business, I felt the same way. I just didn't like the idea of it. But let me try to use our pleasure-pain balance to kind of show you why, for some people, this really is the best solution. So we talked about the heavy use, right? We talked about how when it's the gremlins pile on, this process of neuroadaptation where the brain changes. We talked about when the substance is gone, it tips to the other way, they experience pain, dysphoria-driven relapse. The gremlins are supposed to get off, okay? And the hope the hope is that over time, maybe it'll take years, but the gremlins will get off, the balance will be righted, that individual will achieve homeostasis and they can lead a normal life. But what we believe happens in some cases is that the scale is permanently broken. It cannot re-achieve homeostasis. So the only way for that individual to have a chance to feel normal again and function in the world is to add on methadone or Suboxone, bring up the level balance, and let that individual have a chance to not be in constant pain so that they can engage in effective recovery through whatever psychosocial spiritual modality they can find. This is also an argument for, pulling your kid out of whatever environment they're in and putting them in a wilderness school or a 30 or 60 or 90-day residential treatment program. The data on whether or not residential treatment programs work there's not a lot of data where people are still examining that, what really works, what doesn't. But again, if you have an individual who has dysphoria-driven compulsions to use, they can't maintain abstinence even though they want to. If you put them in an environment where the drug is not available, then they will have more of a chance potentially of reestablishing homeostasis. So I have lots of parents say to me, what should we do? Should we put our kid in therapeutic boarding school, in a wilderness program, in a residential setting? This is often the case when we've tried many other outpatient interventions. I said, if it were my kid, I would do that. Because remember, you have the developing brain. They're creating the scaffolding on which their entire life will be based. If you put them in a program like that and they can't use, there's a better chance that they will re-achieve homeostasis. Psychosocial treatments are very, very important. I'm a big proponent of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, other peer recoveries. We know that when people actively engage in these peer recovery programs, they are very, very effective. If people don't engage in them, they won't work, but that would be true if you were taking aspirin. If you didn't take it or only took a quarter of the aspirin, you wouldn't get better. So I'm a big proponent, and there's good literature to show that these groups work for young people as well. There are problems in these groups, like with any intervention, but these are highly effective treatments when people actively engage. So what happened to Justin? He got on Suboxone. It stabilized him. I administered Suboxone along with intensive monitoring. This is very important. He got regular urine tox screens to make sure he wasn't using other substances. I pulled his family into the treatment. They monitored his behavior as well. He went to a couple of NA meetings. It didn't really work for him. But instead, what he discovered was his own kind of sober community. Ironically, he went back online and subscribed to a site called penandpaper.com. Penandpaper.com was a site where he could find out about games and communities that did not involve the internet. These are tabletop games. He started going to these tabletop games where basically they sit around and they reenact characters in these complex storylines. These are, by the way, mostly quite nerdy, introspective types, so not what you would imagine. But he's sitting around this and he would have a group of 5 or 6 of these friends he made, actual friends who came to his house, and they interacted in this tabletop game where they would sort of go out and have these characters who had backstories, and they would say what happened next and what happened next. And what Justin said about his recovery was that there were 3 pieces to his recovery. The first piece was the support of his parents, the loving relationship that he had with them. The second piece was the Suboxone. Okay, absolutely vital to help stop the cravings. And the third piece was these tabletop games where he could live out this exciting alternative life that he did experience with drug use, but that he could no longer engage in if he was going to stay sober. So this was a wonderful vehicle for him, and he was especially engaged in this one game called Shadowrun. His character was J-Rez, and he had all these cybernetic abilities. And when I asked him, well, what's going on now? You know, what's the storyline? He said, it was very interesting to me how much the storyline mirrored a kind of fantasy storyline in his drug life. Basically, J-Rez and the others in the group were trying to catch a drug dealer, and they had a lot of trouble catching the drug dealer, and there were bombs and cybernetic abilities, and he was the hero. And then they realized that the reason they hadn't been able to catch the villain was because he turned into a dragon and flew away. I said, oh, you're chasing the dragon. He said, yeah, I guess I still am. Yeah. So we are growing up in a different world. Our young people are growing up in a very different space than even a generation ago, even 10 years ago. The gateway really has become a runway. This distinction between soft and hard drugs really no longer exists. They have immediate access to drugs that are essentially the equivalent of heroin and speed readily available to them. And you can have the most wonderful parenting and the most structured home and do everything right, and your kids are going to leave that home and go into a world, into a school system where they are going to have access. And so we are going to have to get very creative and use our common will and our creativity to think of new solutions for new problems in these challenging times. Thanks for listening. So I'd be happy to take questions. So the question is there a difference between a strong habit and an addiction? It's an interesting question because it brings forward how complex the language is around addiction, how we don't have a good language. Is it a habit? Is it an addiction? Basically the difference, the threshold there, I think, is really, so I think it is a continuum, so, and this is reflected in the new DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that you can have a mild, moderate, or severe addiction. Okay, so it is a spectrum disorder, but you can also have use that's not remotely addictive, and you can have risky use that doesn't meet the threshold criteria for addiction. I think that the dividing line, and people would draw it in different places, between a habit and an addiction is continued use despite consequences. Compulsive use, a lot of your mental real estate occupied with thinking about using, covering up the use, getting the next supply, and out of control use. Those are sort of the DSM criteria, the 3 C's: continued use despite consequences, out of control use, and compulsive use. So your second question. Okay, so I'm just going to stop you there. This is a really universal problem for parents today. They know their child has a problem. They want to be loving and involved and supportive. How do you do that without becoming an enabler? I do not have the answers to that, but what I say to families is, this is a very challenging situation. How can you show your love and show your support and not contribute to the problem? I send people to Al-Anon, so that's a great place to hear from other families how they manage this problem, what codependency is, how codependency itself can be a kind of addiction. I urge people not to do things like give cash to that child, because cash is very flexible and can be used to purchase things that you don't want the child to purchase. If you want to support the child financially, do a direct kind of pay for their rent or pay for their car insurance, but don't give them cash. And also speak in a transparent way about what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. One of the saddest and most mysterious things to me in my clinical work is how many parents are held hostage by their addicted children. If I had an answer to how to make that go away because they love that child, it is so hard to know how to be there for them and yet not be an enabler. So it's a huge topic, a very important one. I don't have all the answers, but those are some of the roads I begin to go down with families. Having naloxone around, have it at your home. The other thing is, just get a lot of psychological support for yourself. And a very good therapist can help you build up a contract. These are our limits. This is what we're willing to do, what we're not willing to do. But you got to talk real with your child, even if they're denying, say, we know this is happening. We love you. We are doing this because we love you, even if it doesn't feel loving to you. But in general, people who are on withdrawal will be dysphoric, irritable, have insomnia, and have depression. So those are those four are the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance. When is the brain cleared out? Wasn't it? Well, that prompts me to say one very important thing. This is the stages of change concept that people have to be ready to go into recovery before you should offer them recovery. I really think that's hogwash because of the hijacked brain notion and because he wasn't clear-headed. And until you get your brain back, you can't make that kind of decision because you're still essentially under the influence. And I see this clinically all the time in the emergency room where someone comes in and talks to you, they say, do you want a treatment for addiction? They say no. I said, if you would put that person in the hospital and wait 3 days and ask them again, you will get a different answer. One of the kind of more intangibles that I look for good recovery is no longer leading the double life and no longer lying. To me, those are really, really important. When there's still lying going on and still leading the double life, they're not yet in good recovery. So this is a very huge public health issue. Here we have one of the most effective treatments for opioid use disorder, supported by the evidence, really good data. Suboxone, opioid agonist treatment. And yet, if you have an individual on Suboxone, there are many, many residential rehabilitation places that will not take them while they're on Suboxone. Now, I just this week sent a kid to Fremont Hospital. So shout out for Fremont Hospital. They will take your child in their treatment programs if your child is on Suboxone. This has to do with this age-old bias that I taught, which is why I wanted you guys to stop a moment and talk. People, it's highly stigmatized. People don't like this idea. I had to testify before Congress about this. Lawmakers, congressionals who had been highly educated, they just intrinsically hated the idea of giving opioids to someone who's opioid addicted because they don't understand the neuroscience the way you guys understand it now, and because they haven't had the experience of seeing someone like I have, and many of you possibly have, get their lives back and get into really good recovery and graduate from Stanford with straight A's and go on to get a PhD because of Suboxone. So it's an outrage. Addiction should have parity coverage like other illnesses. It doesn't. We have to fight for that. Again, the great hypocrisy in our medical system. If I write a prescription for Vicodin, that my patient immediately, without any pushback from the insurance company or the pharmacist, can go and pick that up. Vicodin is much more addictive than Suboxone. If I write a prescription for Suboxone, I have to do a prior authorization. I have to call for medical confirmation that there's a really medical necessity for this drug. My patient has to wait 3 days or 4 days or 6 days in acute opioid withdrawal. They have to go there and be shamed and stigmatized. I can only give a certain amount. I can only treat 30 people in the first year and 100 people in the year thereafter. A lot of systemic hypocrisy. I can only validate that that's a huge problem. Right, so a very nice article came out in the New England Journal recently, Volkow and McClellan, and those are like Koob, those are the neuroscientists, but what they say is that in the general population, about 10% of folks, and I think this is answering your question, about 10% of individuals are vulnerable to develop a severe addictive disorder. So if you take 100 people and you give them all a substance, 10 of them will be vulnerable to develop a severe addictive disorder. Yes?
Could you talk just a minute about vaping?
So vaping is this idea, the e-cigarettes kind of introduced all of this, right? That you could have a harm reduction approach to using nicotine if you used it in a vaporizer. And now a lot of other substances are being used in this way, put in these little e-cigarette kind of containers, which has made detection really difficult because now you've got people actually using pot on school grounds because it's in their little vape thing and people think it's nicotine. There really is no evidence, because we haven't had a chance to study it yet, that vaping is any safer. There's a lot of weird chemicals that come out, like formaldehyde, along with the vaped substance that may turn out to be more dangerous. On the other hand, when it comes to cigarettes, there is evidence that it may be indeed a harm reduction approach. It's really all over the map. The clinical challenge that she faces is patients or clients who want to stop but say, I will lose my entire peer and friendship group. I would start by validating that that is true. And that is the number one complaint, not just from teens, but all ages. These are the people I hang out with. This is how we hang out together. This is what we do. Validate that that's really hard, and also validate that in all likelihood, they will have to get new friends. Part of how peer recovery works, NA, AA, is that it allows people to develop a new sober social network. That's been well studied, that's probably one of the strongest mediators, is a sober social network. Whether you get it through tabletop games or Alcoholics Anonymous, you have to take them out of that peer using group, or you have to get the whole group, you know, to change their behavior. A huge challenge. So it's an interesting question. Is it really true that you have to hit a bottom in order to have this moment of insight and awareness that you need help? Probably there has to be kind of a moment, you know, that in my experience, but the bottom is so wide for different people. You know, some people have to end up in jail, homeless, they've lost everything. Other people just have to come home and see the expression on a spouse's face or a loved one's face, and that's enough to make them go into recovery. Justin is a kind of verbally not that expressive. He has difficulty articulating his experiences, so I don't have a rich texture to relate to you, except to say that it was almost for him an existential moment based on chronology and the narrative of his life. And I see that very often, not just a kind of they don't necessarily have to hit a bottom. It's when what they're doing is not consistent with the narrative of who they believe they are. That is when I see a lot of people sort of go, wait a minute, that's not the life I plan to live or want to live. Then there's that desire to want to change life. And then they need a lot of help doing that. That's sort of the bottom line. I'm going to stop because we're out of time. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience.